Good morning, family. Quite a few people in here today. Got some visitors. We are honored by you being here. If it pleases you, we got some visitor cards out on the table. We invite you to fill those out so we can have a record of your attendance. This morning, we're going to continue on with our lesson on sin and virtue. We are on lasciviousness is the word that I'm going with. Most of your translations are going to use the word lust, but we're going to explain why there's kind of a discrepancy in translating it into that word and why we use that word. I promise you I'm staying away from the touchy parts of this subject, okay? But as I've explained before, if the Bible talks about it, it has no business being taboo for us, right? So we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to talk about the sin of lasciviousness, what it does to somebody, how it's affected our society, and chastity is the other part of that. We're going to talk about that and the different forms of that. So, people like you, Brandon, you need to listen up. So, I believe we have two more sins and virtues to go over after this lesson. So, the definition of lasciviousness is to be filled with or showing sexual desire. And this is often, like I said, translated to lust, and most of your translations use that word lust. The difference is that lust is not specifically sexual. Lust can be a strong desire for anything. Somebody can lust after a car or a house or chocolate or whatever. Lust is just a strong desire. Lasciviousness is specifically that sexual desire, right? It comes from the Greek word asalgia, which is why I tell you that lasciviousness is the better translation for that word, because asalgia is specifically talking about a sexual appetite. So here's some of what the scriptures say. Matthew chapter 5, verse 28 says, "But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." And if you were here on Wednesday night, we actually covered this verse a little bit, and we talked about how sin is sin because it comes from the heart. We're going to go over another passage that actually talks about adultery being the one sin that a man takes into himself or does to himself. But ultimately, when we're talking about lasciviousness, the issue is with the heart. And if you want to understand why God sees this issue the way he does, Song of Songs is a great book for you to study on that. I know we tend to stay away from it, but the entire book of Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, depending on how your Bible labels that, that entire book is centered around the idea of avoiding lasciviousness. It's that the main message of that book is to not awaken love before love's time. In fact, that's the line that's used repeatedly throughout that entire book. So for me, I would tell you that if you want to study deeper into why this matters so much to God, that's where you need to go for that. Okay? But we are going to talk about some of the effects of giving into this morning. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 3 says, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual morality, that each one of you know how to control his own body in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God, that no one transgress and wrong his brothers in this matter, because the Lord is an avenger in all these things, as we told you beforehand and solemnly warned you." So, 1 Thessalonians, it's pretty easy, right? We don't have to do a lot of explanation here. God is specifically telling us to avoid sexual morality. That is lasciviousness, right? We're actually going to be on Wednesday. I'm going to cover what sexual immorality is, because the New Testament does not actually tell us in great detail what God considers to be sexually immoral. For that, you have to go to Leviticus, right? Because God gives the entire list of these are the things we just do not do. So if you're interested in studying more about that, I invite you to come in on Wednesday night. We're going to actually go a lot more into detail about what that means for us. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 13, food is meant for the stomach and the stomach for food, and God will destroy both one and the other. The body is not meant for sexual immorality, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. Now I want you to look at society as a whole. How much of our culture, specifically here in America, but in all reality, you can find it anywhere you go. Right? It does not matter. As somebody who's been to several countries, I can tell you it does not matter what culture you're dealing with. The vast majority of public life is centered around sexuality. That's just the case. If you look at the world of advertisement, sex appeal is the number one most used form of advertisement anywhere in the world. Anywhere. We can change what that may look like from generation to generation, decade to decade, but at the end of the day, that's the way the world sells things. Why? Because the world has lied to people and told them that sexual freedom is really what the world will call lasciviousness, right? Sexual freedom is the epitome of liberty. And here's the thing, so often, I'm going to dispel something that I think a lot of people are under the impression. So often we attribute lasciviousness to men. That is not the case. The fact is that statistically speaking, women are just as likely to commit acts of adultery and fornication as men are. Worse yet, and this is just me making a case for why it's so important to defend our marriages, women, the vast majority of women, and this is just going off of polls Stanford University did back in 2013, the majority of women who choose to fornicate outside of marriage, and I believe the number was close to 63%, will choose to pursue married men. This is not men just going outside of their marriages all by themselves. These men are being targeted by women. Why? Because it's easier to choose to be with a partner who's already been vetted by somebody else. Half your work's already done for you. Just my thoughts on that. Now, all of this being said, we're not here to talk about marriage specifically. We're talking about the sin of giving in to this sexual appetite. But it's important for you to note that women are not immune to this. And it doesn't matter. This isn't an American thing, guys. You look at Japan, 87% of marriages have adultery being a repeated form of lifestyle. And what I mean by that is that this isn't a matter of 87% of marriages have a case of adultery. It's actually a repeated behavior. It's not just an American thing. You go to places like many countries in Africa, where in any place where a man is not actually allowed to have multiple women, he's having multiple women. Now, it's more in your more developed countries, more liberal countries like America, and countries like England, countries like France, and things like that. That's where you're seeing women being more openly liberal on these matters. But the fact is, it happens no matter where you go. So, as I said before, next week, hopefully you guys will attend. I know that, and I'm choosing to do this study on Wednesday because as much as I say it shouldn't be taboo for us to talk about, it is not my place to insist that your children hear me talk about details on sexual immorality. On Wednesday night, there's classes downstairs for your kids if you don't want them to be present for that lesson. That's why I'm choosing to do that on Wednesday, okay? But if you think they need to hear it, you got teens, bring them. We'll talk about it. Abstinence, chastity, to move on to the virtue that stands in contrast to the lasciviousness is chastity. It's to abstain or abstention from unlawful sexual intercourse or abstention from all sexual intercourse. Now, here's the main difference. If you are married, sleeping with your wife is actually a form of chastity because it is lawful. The other part of this. Now, there's a few exceptions. We'll be going over them. The only time when that is exempted is, as 1 Corinthians will tell us, when both the husband and wife agree to abstain altogether. Now, concerning this is chapter 7, verse 1 through 5 of 1 Corinthians. Now, concerning the matter about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual morality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, if you're reading that closely, this is actually really akin to the idea of fasting. The word wasn't coming to me. So it's kind of akin to fasting. If me and my wife agree that we need a period of focus on God, we can choose to abstain from this fleshly activity in order to spend more time in prayer. Just like fasting, the idea is I'm going to abstain from eating in order to focus more wholly on prayer. It's about dedicating that time. But this is the only time when it is morally acceptable for a husband and wife to turn each other down or to not be given to those behaviors. Now, what 1 Corinthians actually tells us, and this is really does not go over well for a lot of people. But what 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is actually telling us is if you are turning down your spouse, especially on a repeated basis, you are guilty of putting them in a position of temptation. There's no way around that. That's not my opinion. That's not me being misogynistic. That's what the scriptures are saying. If you are turning down your spouse, you are putting them in a place of temptation. Does that mean they're guilty for giving into that temptation if they choose to do so? Absolutely. Absolutely. But you don't get to force them into that position of complete chastity and then say, well, my hands are clean because I didn't sleep with anybody. The fact is, when we're looking at cases of adultery, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, there is no innocent party. That's what most marriage counselors tell us. The fact of the matter is, when adultery is involved in a marriage, there is almost never an innocent party. I'm not saying there isn't ever cases where people are just doing the wrong thing for the sake of doing the wrong thing. That happens. But most of the time, there's two guilty people involved. Sorry, thought there was one more slide. So one of the things I want to point out to you is this idea of lasciviousness. I want to talk about what it actually does. Okay? Sexual responses to an opposite gender, right? This idea of having relations, of being intimate. God designed it to be a spiritually bonding experience, right? That's that whole idea of cleaving to your wife and becoming one flesh. The idea is the act itself brings about a spiritually bonding experience that is meant to last for an entire lifetime. So, young people, I especially want you to hear this. What happens when you pursue those activities with people you are not committed to? Because you can't change what the behavior does. Right? You are going to be bonded with that person, whether you choose or not. Meaningless sex does not exist. And I will tell you that as somebody who lived a very long time in his life guilty of this very sin. There is no such thing as meaningless sex. No matter who you're doing it with, no matter how many times, no matter what the situation is, it bonds you to the other person. So young people, some of you older people, how many wives do you have? How many husbands do you have? How many people have you cleaved your soul to? I tell you this as somebody who looks back with some regret. I wish that I could answer one to that answer, to that question. There is oftentimes I look at my wife, I look at my family, I wish that I had known the things I know now. The unfortunate thing is there are certain sins, as we talked about not too long ago, there are certain sins we are so willing to speak out against. And then there are some sins we really don't want to talk about. To me, I believe that if we're looking at the rise in sexual immorality among Christians, I think you can draw direct parallels to how often we were willing to talk about this as Christians. There is a great many places that would not let me preach this sermon because of the content, because of the topic. But I don't think you can argue that it's not important for us to talk about. It needs to be talked about. The fact is, the vast majority of young people, right, if you're looking at the far back right of this room, which is the people who should be listening to this more than anybody, if you look at people that age, most of them who label themselves as Christians cannot give you a scriptural reason for why they should be chaste. I can tell you this from teaching at Bible camp. I can tell you this from preaching at other churches, teaching young people at other congregations. I can tell you this from the Christians I went to school with. Most of them not only cannot give you a scriptural reason for chastity, but don't believe it's necessary. Whose fault is that? Social media? The news? Society? It's interesting how we're willing to talk to kids about the importance of having a good work ethic and the importance of understanding finances and keeping your house in order, and how few times we're willing to sit down and talk to them about the importance of sex. I have talked to a great many young men who understand far too little on the subject. And we tell them, well, you know, they're young people. They don't need to be talking about it. Guess what? They're talking about it. As a guy, I can tell you, in first grade, we were talking about it. And it only got worse from first grade, right? At no point did it become less of a topic for us. The only problem really was there was no grown man who knew what he was talking about involved in the conversation. It was a bunch of stupid, immature kids deciding to try to figure out what this was all about. And guess what? We almost always came to all of the wrong conclusions. There is so many excuses for why this is tolerable or allowable. It has bordered the word ridiculous. We have so many phrases that tolerate this behavior. It is disgustingly sad. Right? If you're talking about somebody over the age of I would say 40 or 50, you're probably familiar with the term sowing his wild oats. It's a pretty commonly used term, right? What was this? This was me as an older person giving an excuse for why my younger son was allowed to go out and participate in this activity, he was just sowing his wild oats. You realize those oats are your grandchildren, right? I mean, do you understand how absolutely sad and ridiculous it is that we would be okay with that concept? How many kids do you want popping up at your door on Christmas going, "Hey, Grandma"? Now we say things that are even more disturbing and more direct. Things like, well, you wouldn't buy a car without test driving it first. My biggest problem with this is, why in the world is that woman being labeled a car? Why is that all the more value she has to you? That you would say, I'm going to treat her like I would a car that I'm looking to buy. That is not the same thing. Right? That car's value depreciates the minute you get in the wheel, whether it's a test drive or not. You think you're treating her value any differently? Men, you think you're exempt from this? You think your value doesn't also decrease the more times you get used? How many women do you actually think wants to be with a man who considers himself a stallion? How many women do you think actually want to be with a man who's experienced every woman he's ever met? No woman wants that kind of pressure. I can promise you that. I'm not a woman. I'm not going to pretend to understand, but I can tell you right now they don't want that. You know why? Because all that is pressure. Now I have to live up to the standards of the other however many women you've been with. Women, men feel the same way about you, whether we're willing to admit it or not. The more men you were with, the higher the standard I have to live up to. And most of the time, I'm going to let you in on a secret to men. Most of the time, we are too self-conscious to be bothered with something like that. Most of us have way too fragile of an ego to be able to handle that situation. Yeah, I was used to be really big into reading and telling jokes. Now I just use humor. I don't really tell jokes. But I remember reading one as a kid. This girlfriend, she's talking to her boyfriend. She asked him, "Why is it that when a woman sleeps with a lot of men, her value in society goes down? She's called names. She's looked down on. But when men sleep with a lot of women, they're lifted up and celebrated." And his response is, well, when a lock is opened by many keys, it's just a really bad lock. When a key opens a lot of locks, it's considered a master key. Here's the thing. I tell you this because I want you to understand that's how the vast majority of people see this issue. That's how the vast majority of people see this issue. Now, as somebody who has a unique experience with locks, I can tell you this. The least secure lock is one that has a master key. And a master key will, over time, destroy a lock because that lock is not meant for that key. So once again, we have this euphemism that we use in society that completely falls apart when you apply logic to it. I know that this has kind of been awkward for some of you. I can see it because of the immature responses I'm getting from the back corner over there. And it's okay to make light of it on certain levels. I mean, we almost have to. But on the other hand, this has to be taken seriously. On the other hand, it has to be taken seriously because the simple fact is, the less serious you take this issue of lasciviousness and chastity, the more likely it is you're going to decrease your value in a potential partner's eyes, the more likely it is you're going to have to settle for something you shouldn't have had to settle for. How many people do you want to bond your soul to in your life? Because this isn't just about one night of fun. This isn't about feeling good in a moment. When a man and a woman become one flesh, God designed that action to be for life. There is a commitment that is built into that action, whether you consciously make the commitment or not. More importantly, this kind of behavior leads to all kinds of practical problems. You have what we call now blended homes that stem from this exact kind of behavior. Right? I'm going to sleep with a woman and she's going to get pregnant, but I didn't want to commit to her. I just thought she looked pretty and I was going to have a good night. So now you have a kid with her, but then later on down the road, you actually meet somebody worthy of that commitment. You make a commitment, except now she has the added pressure of trying to be a stepmom to the kid you had with someone you didn't even care about. Now her life is made more complicated because of your stupid decisions. Women, you think it's any easier for men in that situation? Do you know how difficult of a concept it is for a man to consider being a stepdad? Because here's the thing. When a man becomes a stepdad, everything comes into question. He's not even questioning his worth compared to whoever that kid's dad is. He has to ask himself every single time that kid does anything what he is and is not allowed to do. And society has their views of him. You're going to have your views of him. He is never going to measure up. In his mind, he is never going to measure up to the value of a regular full dad. And you put him in that situation because of a stupid decision you chose to make. I'm willing to talk to the entire congregation about this, even though obviously this is a younger person issue for most of you. But here's the thing. If it was being talked about enough, I probably wouldn't have to preach about it. So older people, if you're listening to this and thinking that you can ignore this morning, you can't. Because as people who know the truth of this matter, the responsibility to speak truth into young people's lives falls on you. Now, there's a lot of people whose parents aren't in the picture, and you say, well, that's the parents' job. Well, guess what? They're not doing it. That's just the truth. If they were, it'd be getting done, and we wouldn't be facing these issues that we have. So the parents aren't doing it, but the grandparents aren't doing it. Or name your person, they're not getting the job done. Are you willing to continue letting the next generation fall deeper and deeper and deeper into this pit that is sexual immorality just because it's not your job? The fact is, speaking truth to one another, calling sins, urging each other toward the path of righteousness, you can't point to one person and say that's their job. If you know what the truth is, you have a responsibility to speak truth. If you know what righteousness is, you have a responsibility to show others how to get there. If you know what the grace of God looks like, you have a responsibility to show that to the people who don't know what it looks like. If you know what the commandments of God are, you have a responsibility to tell other people what the commandments of God are. It doesn't fall on somebody because of relationship. It doesn't fall on somebody because of the role that they play in somebody's life. It falls on the people who know what is right to do what is right and to teach other people to do the same. So older people who are listening to this, you have children, you have grandchildren, some of you have great-grandchildren. Guess what? You are not exempt from the responsibility of teaching young people what the truth of this matter. Protect your soul. Live your life in a way that one day you can commit to one person. Or at the very least, the fewest possible people. Protect your marriage. Don't deny yourself to one another as if you actually belong to yourself. If you were here for Bible study, we talked about this, right? What you have and what you are actually belongs to God. You own nothing. As somebody who is a slave to Christ, which is biblical, right? We don't get to call it, we're not servants. We're not employees. We are slaves to Christ. We got given that title the minute we called him Lord, Savior, and Master, which means your body itself belongs to him. It is not yours to deny. Both husbands and wives, you need to know this. You need to remember it. That's how we protect our marriages. Protecting our marriages means knowing the facts about how the world operates. That there are people out there who will attack your marriage at its weakest point just for the sake of feeling powerful. Protect the young people that you know. There are so many of them that are growing up without the responsible adults necessary to teach them what is right and wrong on this matter. That's why they can't take the subject seriously, because no one ever talks to them about it. I can always tell who's had the talk from their dad in a room of guys by who is able to say the word sex without laughing. Because to those of us with a responsible father figure in our lives or in their lives, you can identify them because the fact is they take the subject seriously. And the people without those figures in their lives, you can tell them because it is such a taboo, embarrassing subject that they don't know how to talk about it. So now I've identified the problem. I've identified what God's commands are. I've identified what your roles are. And I've identified how to know when somebody else has not been given proper instruction. So now it falls on you. Teach one another. Encourage one another. And stay the path of righteousness. This morning, we want to invite you forward. We give the same offer every time we get together, and it's just as important every time we get together. If you have sinned, to confess. If you'd like to make that confession so that your family here can pray for you, can pray with you, can be holding you accountable so that you can walk away from that path of sin, we want you to come forward and make that confession open. Not so that you can be embarrassed, not so that we can hold it over your head. It's not so we can think less of you. It's so that we can help you stay the path of righteousness. That's what confession is about. To unburden yourself with that load. This morning, if you're looking for prayers in any capacity, or if it's about this issue specifically, if you're looking for reconciliation either to a specific person in the church or to the church as a whole, whatever your needs are this morning, if you're looking for salvation, which can be found through grace, by faith, through obedience to the gospel, the waters of baptism, whatever your needs are this morning, we're ready. We want you to bring them forward and make them known so that we can help you see them now as we stand and sing.